Little girl forced by stepfather to eat leftovers calls her emergency contact, a CEO answers. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and type family in the comments. A beautiful piece of good news may come your way very soon. And don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. The fluorescent light in the kitchen flickered like a dying heartbeat as 8-year-old Chloe stared down at the congealed meatloaf on her plate. The gravy had formed a thick, unappetizing skin, and the mashed potatoes looked more like cement than food. Her baby brother Tyler squirmed in the makeshift sling she'd fashioned from an old yellow dish rag, his tiny fists grabbing at her long blonde hair as he fussed. "I said eat it." Derek's voice cut through the oppressive silence like a rusty blade. Her stepfather stood in the doorway, his work boots still muddy from the construction site, his beer belly straining against a stained white t-shirt, his cold grey eyes fixed on Chloe with the same disgust he reserved for the cockroaches that scurried across their apartment floor. That food cost money, and money don't grow on trees in this house. Chloe's stomach churned as she lifted the fork with trembling fingers. The meat was cold and rubbery, tasting like cardboard mixed with congealed fat. Tyler let out a sharp cry, and she automatically bounced him gently, trying to soothe his hunger while forcing herself to swallow another bite. The baby hadn't eaten in hours either. Derek had hidden the formula when her mother Rachel left for her double shift at the diner. "Faster!" Derek barked, cracking open another beer with unnecessary force. The sound echoed through their cramped 2-bedroom apartment like a gunshot. "Your mama's working her ass off to put food on this table, and you're sitting there like some princess who's too good for leftovers." The irony wasn't lost on Chloe, even at her young age. These weren't just any leftovers. They were Derek's leftovers from 2 nights ago, the same meal he'd wolfed down while watching football and shouting at the television. The same meal her mother had carefully prepared before her stepfather declared it dog food and ordered pizza instead. Now, with Rachel working 16-hour days to make ends meet, Derek delighted in watching Chloe gag down his discarded scraps. Tyler's crying intensified, his tiny face scrunching up in distress. Chloe tried to rock him while eating, but the baby's weight in the makeshift sling made her arms ache. At just 8 years old, she'd become his primary caregiver whenever their mother wasn't around. Derek refused to so much as hold Tyler, claiming he was probably not even mine anyway, a cruel taunt that made Rachel's face crumble every time he said it. "Can you give him a bottle?" Chloe asked softly, her voice barely audible above Tyler's wails. "He's hungry." Derek's face darkened like a storm cloud. He slammed his beer down on the scratched linoleum counter so hard that foam sprayed across the surface. "Did I ask for your opinion, little girl? Did I?" Chloe shook her head quickly, her blue eyes filling with tears she desperately tried to hide. Derek fed off fear like a vampire feeds on blood, and any sign of weakness only made him crueler. She'd learned that lesson the hard way during the 2 years he'd been living with them, 2 years that felt like a lifetime of walking on eggshells and swallowing her words along with his stale leftovers. "The boy can wait until your mama gets home," Derek continued, his voice dripping with malice. "And if you don't finish every bite on that plate, he'll be waiting a lot longer. Maybe hungry babies learn to cry quieter." The threat hung in the air like toxic smoke. Chloe forced down another bite, then another, each one making her stomach clench with nausea. Tyler's cries became more desperate, more heartbroken, and she felt her chest tighten with a panic she was too young to understand but too familiar with to ignore. The front door of their apartment building slammed somewhere below, followed by heavy footsteps on the stairs. Derek's head snapped toward the sound, and for a moment hope flickered in Chloe's chest. Maybe it was her mother coming home early. Maybe this nightmare would end. But the footsteps continued past their door, fading into the upper levels of the building. Derek's cruel smile returned as he settled back against the counter, crossing his arms over his broad chest. The silence stretched between them like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. "You know what your problem is, Chloe." Derek's voice took on that false, conversational tone that always preceded his worst verbal attacks. "You think you're special. You think because your mama spoils you rotten, the world owes you something. But let me tell you a secret. You ain't nothing special. You're just another mouth to feed in a house that can barely afford one." Tyler's crying reached a fever pitch, his small body shaking with the force of his distress. Chloe could feel his tiny heart hammering against her chest through the thin fabric of the dish rag sling. The sound tore at her heart worse than any of Derek's words ever could. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking like ice on a frozen pond. "Just let me give him water or something, anything." Derek's laugh was harsh and humorless, like the bark of a diseased dog. "Please? Oh, now she's begging. That's more like it. That's what I like to see. A little respect." He took a long pull from his beer, savoring her desperation like fine wine. "But the answer's still no. You want to help the baby? Finish your goddamn dinner." Chloe stared down at the remaining meatloaf, her vision blurring with unshed tears. The meat looked even more disgusting now, cold and congealed in its own grease. But Tyler's cries were growing weaker, more hoarse, and she knew she had to do something, anything. Her eyes drifted to the old cordless phone, sitting on the counter, its plastic surface yellowed with age and sticky with kitchen grease. Her mother had written important numbers on a piece of paper taped to the refrigerator. The pediatrician, the poison control center, the police. But something else caught her attention, a small scrap of paper tucked behind the phone, with a number written in her mother's careful handwriting. It was a number Chloe had never seen before, with no name attached. Just 10 digits in blue ink, slightly faded, as if it had been written in a hurry. Her mother's secret number, perhaps. A backup plan she'd never mentioned? Derek was distracted now, rummaging through the refrigerator in search of another beer. His broad back blocked most of the kitchen, giving Chloe a precious few seconds of cover. Without really thinking about what she was doing, she reached for the phone with one hand while supporting Tyler with the other. Her small fingers trembled as she dialed the mysterious number. Each beep seemed as loud as a fire alarm in the quiet apartment, but Derek was too absorbed in his beer hunt to notice. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a voice answered, deep, professional, with just a hint of concern. "Hello?" Chloe's throat closed up. She hadn't planned what to say, hadn't thought beyond the desperate need to reach out to someone, anyone who might help. Tyler let out another weak cry against her chest, and the sound broke through her paralysis. "Daddy," she whispered into the phone, the word slipping out before she could stop it. It was what she'd always wanted to call someone, what she'd dreamed of having, a father who would protect her instead of torment her. "I've been eating leftovers for days. He forces us to." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for an eternity. Then the voice came back, sharper now, more alert. "Who is this? Where are you?" But Derek had found his beer and was turning around, his piggy eyes narrowing as he spotted the phone in Chloe's hand. His face went from confusion to rage in the span of a heartbeat, and Chloe knew she was in more trouble than she'd ever been in her young life. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Derek's voice exploded through the kitchen like a thunderclap, causing Tyler to jolt in Chloe's arms and let out a terrified shriek. The cordless phone felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in her small hand as her stepfather advanced on her, his face purple with rage. On the other end of the line, the deep voice was still there, now sharp with concern. "Hello? Hello? Are you still there?" Chloe's throat closed up completely. She could hear Derek's heavy work boots stomping across the linoleum toward her, could smell the beer on his breath mixing with the stale cigarette smoke that clung to his clothes like a toxic cloud. Tyler's cries grew more frantic as he sensed the danger approaching. "Give me that phone," Derek snarled, reaching for it with one meaty hand. But something in Chloe snapped. Maybe it was Tyler's terrified cries. Maybe it was the taste of 2-day-old meatloaf still coating her tongue. Or maybe it was just 8 years of watching her mother shrink a little more each day under this man's cruelty. "We live at 847 Cedar Street, apartment 3B, she said quickly into the phone, her voice barely above a whisper, but crystal clear. "The baby needs food, and he won't." Derek's hand clamped down on the phone, yanking it away from her ear with such force that Chloe stumbled backward, clutching Tyler protectively against her chest. The baby's wails reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the thin walls of their apartment. "Who were you talking to?" Derek's voice was dangerously quiet now, the kind of quiet that preceded his worst explosions. He held the phone up to his ear, but the line was dead. "Who were you talking to?" Chloe pressed herself against the refrigerator, feeling the cool metal against her back through her thin cotton dress. Tyler's tiny fists clutched at the yellow dish rag sling, his face red and streaked with tears. She could feel his little body trembling against hers, and it broke her heart that someone so small already knew to be afraid. I don't know," she stammered, which was technically the truth. She had no idea who had answered that mysterious number, only that his voice had been kind and concerned, the opposite of every male voice she'd heard in this apartment for the past 2 years. Derek's eyes narrowed to slits. He was a big man, made bigger by his anger and the way he used his size to intimidate. At 6'2" and nearly 250 pounds, he towered over Chloe like a mountain over a flower. His work-stained hands clenched into fists at his sides, and she instinctively hunched over Tyler, trying to shield him from whatever was coming next. "You lying little brat," Derek hissed, spittle flying from his lips. "I heard you call someone daddy. What kind of sick game are you playing?" Before Chloe could answer, the apartment door burst open with a crash that made them both jump. Rachel stumbled through the doorway, her waitress uniform wrinkled and stained with coffee and grease, her blonde hair escaping from a messy ponytail. Dark circles shadowed her green eyes, and her hands shook with exhaustion as she dropped her purse on the floor. "Derek, what's all the screaming about?" "Oh," she asked, her voice hoarse from another 16-hour shift at the diner. "I could hear Tyler crying from the hallway, and Mrs. Patterson from 2A stopped me to complain again about the noise." Rachel Matthews had once been beautiful. The kind of beauty that stopped traffic and made men write poetry. At 38, traces of that beauty remained in the sharp line of her cheekbones and the natural wave of her honey-blonde hair. But 2 years with Derek had worn her down like water on stone, leaving her thin and hollow-eyed, jumping at shadows and apologizing for things that weren't her fault. "Your precious daughter," Derek sneered, pointing an accusatory finger at Chloe, "decided to make some phone calls while you were out. Called up some stranger and started telling stories about how awful her life is here." Rachel's tired eyes widened as she took in the scene. Chloe pressed against the refrigerator, with Tyler crying in her arms, Derek looming over them both like a storm cloud, the kitchen table still set with the plate of congealed leftovers that had started this whole nightmare. "Chloe, honey, what happened?" Rachel moved toward her daughter, but Derek stepped sideways, blocking her path. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, a reminder of who held power in this household. "She called someone Daddy," Derek continued, his voice dripping with false concern. "Got me wondering who she thinks her daddy is, since the last I heard, the loser who knocked you up with her took off before she could even walk." Rachel's face went pale, then flushed with anger. It was one of Derek's favorite weapons, reminding her that Chloe's biological father had abandoned them when Chloe was barely a year old, leaving Rachel to raise a baby alone while working 2 jobs and living in a studio apartment that barely qualified as habitable. "Don't," Rachel said quietly, but her voice carried a warning that made even Derek pause. Don't bring him into this. Why not? Derek's cruel smile widened. Maybe it's time little Chloe learned the truth about her daddy, about how he promised to marry her mama and then disappeared the minute things got real. About how he left you broke and pregnant and— Stop! The word exploded from Rachel's lips with such force that even Tyler's crying quieted for a moment. She stepped around Derek, scooping Chloe and Tyler into her arms in one fluid motion. The familiar scent of her mother's perfume, vanilla and jasmine, now mixed with the smell of grease and coffee from the diner, wrapped around Chloe like a security blanket. For a moment the kitchen was silent except for Tyler's gradually subsiding whimpers. Rachel's arms were strong around both children, and Chloe felt safer than she had in hours. Her mother's hands smoothed her hair, checking for injuries, cataloguing the emotional damage with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this too many times before. He made me eat his leftovers, Chloe whispered against her mother's shoulder. And Tyler's been crying for hours. He wouldn't let me give him a bottle. Rachel's body went rigid when she lifted her head to look at Derek. Her green eyes blazed with a fury that Chloe had never seen before. It was the kind of anger that had been building for months, maybe years, finally reaching its breaking point. You did what? Rachel's voice was deadly quiet. Derek shrugged, suddenly looking less confident now that Rachel was home. The girl needed to learn some respect. You spoil her rotten, Rachel. Someone's got to teach her that food costs money and— She's 8 years old, Rachel cut him off, her voice rising with each word. 8 years old, and you made her eat garbage while my baby cried from hunger. What is wrong with you? Nothing's wrong with me, Derek shot back, his own anger rekindling. What's wrong is that you're raising a spoiled brat who thinks she can call up strangers and tell lies about her family. You want to know what she said? She told some random person that we force her to eat leftovers and gave out our address. What if that was some kind of predator? What if it was someone who could help us? The words slipped out before Chloe could stop them, and both adults turned to stare at her. Tyler had finally quieted in her mother's arms, his tiny fists still clutching at the yellow dish rag, but his breathing had evened out into something resembling peace. Help us with what, baby? Rachel asked gently, smoothing Chloe's hair back from her forehead. Chloe looked up at her mother, seeing her for the first time in months. The dark circles under her eyes, the way her uniform hung loose on her shrinking frame, the careful way she held herself around Derek like she was walking through a minefield. Help us get away from him, Chloe whispered, so quietly that only Rachel could hear. But Derek heard something in the silence that followed, something that made his face darken again. He grabbed his jacket from the back of a chair and headed for the door, pausing only to deliver one final threat. You better figure out how to control your kid, Rachel, and you better figure it out fast. Because I'm getting real tired of being the bad guy in this family. The front door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. In the sudden quiet, Tyler let out a small sigh and settled more comfortably against Rachel's chest. Chloe could feel her mother's heart beating fast under her thin uniform, could feel the tremors of fear and anger running through her body like electric current. "Mom?" Chloe whispered. "Who do you think answered the phone?" Rachel was quiet for a long moment, staring at the door Derek had just slammed. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful, almost wondering. "I don't know, baby, but maybe it was exactly who we needed it to be." Rachel's hands trembled as she heated a bottle for Tyler, her mind racing through the events of the evening like a movie stuck on repeat. The mysterious phone call, Derek's rage, the way Chloe had looked pressed against that refrigerator, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. "Mama, your hands are shaking," Chloe observed from her perch at the kitchen table, where she was finally eating real food, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich that Rachel had made with shaking fingers. Tyler was cradled in the crook of her other arm, finally calm now that he was getting the nourishment he'd been denied for hours. "I'm just tired, baby," Rachel lied, testing the temperature of the formula against her wrist. But the truth was more complicated than tiredness. The truth was that something had shifted tonight. Some invisible line had been crossed, and she wasn't sure there was any going back. The cordless phone sat on the counter like an accusation, its little red light blinking to indicate missed calls. 3 of them, according to the display, all from the same number, the number that was written on that scrap of paper she'd hidden behind the phone almost a year ago. Rachel's stomach clenched as she remembered writing down that number, remembered the night that had produced it. She'd been so angry with Derek that night, so hurt and humiliated by something cruel he'd said in front of their neighbors. She'd stormed out of the apartment, leaving Chloe with Mrs. Patterson next door, and ended up at Murphy's bar downtown, crying into a whiskey sour and wondering how her life had gone so wrong. That's where she'd met him. The man with the kind eyes and the expensive suit who'd offered to buy her a drink and actually listened when she talked. James something, she thought his name was, though the details were fuzzy thanks to the alcohol and the emotional whirlwind of that night. He'd been everything Derek wasn't: gentle, intelligent, successful. He'd made her feel beautiful again, desirable again, like she was worth more than the scraps of affection Derek threw her way when he was in a good mood. One thing had led to another, and she'd ended up in his hotel room at the Marriott downtown. It had been the first time in years that someone had touched her with genuine tenderness, the first time she'd felt truly wanted instead of merely tolerated. She'd fallen asleep in his arms, feeling like maybe, just maybe, her life could be different. But morning had brought reality crashing back. She was still a single mother with an abusive boyfriend and 2 minimum-wage jobs. He was still clearly out of her league, probably had a wife and kids somewhere, probably thought of her as nothing more than a one-night stand with a damaged woman from the wrong side of town. She'd left before he woke up, but not before quickly scribbling down his phone number from the business card on his nightstand. She'd told herself she'd never use it, that it was just insurance, a reminder that somewhere out there was a man who had treated her like she mattered, even if it was only for one night. 3 weeks later, she'd discovered she was pregnant. Rachel's eyes drifted to Tyler, now contentedly drinking his bottle in her arms. At 13 months old, he looked nothing like Derek. His hair was darker, his features more refined. Derek had noticed, of course. He made snide comments about paternity and questioned whether Tyler was really his whenever he wanted to hurt her. But Rachel had never corrected his assumption, had never told him that the timing made it impossible for Derek to be Tyler's father. The truth was too dangerous, too complicated, and what good would it do? The man from that night, James, was clearly successful and sophisticated. He lived in a world of business cards and hotel suites and expensive suits. What would he want with a broken-down waitress and her children? "Mama?" Chloe's voice broke through her reverie. "The phone's ringing." Rachel looked down at the cordless phone in her free hand, surprised to see that she'd picked it up without realizing it. The caller ID showed the same number from those missed calls, the number she'd hidden behind the phone for almost a year. Her finger hovered over the answer button. Tyler finished his bottle and made a small, satisfied sound against her shoulder. Chloe watched her with those perceptive blue eyes that seemed to see too much for someone so young. "Are you going to answer it?" Chloe asked softly. Rachel took a deep breath and pressed the button. "Hello?" "Thank God," the voice on the other end said, and Rachel's knees nearly buckled at the sound. It was him, James, from that night, though his voice was tight with concern now instead of smooth with alcohol and whiskey. "I've been trying to call back for over an hour. Are you okay? Is the little girl okay?" Rachel's voice caught in her throat, A dozen questions crowded her mind. How did he know Chloe was a little girl? Why had he kept trying to call? What did he think was happening here? How did you get this number? There was a pause on the other end of the line. A child called me tonight. She said someone was forcing her to eat leftovers, that a baby needed food. She called me Daddy. His voice softened on the last word, as if it held some special significance. She gave me an address, 847 Cedar Street, apartment 3B. That's you, isn't it, Rachel? Rachel's heart stopped. He knew her name. After almost a year, he still remembered her name. James, she whispered, sinking down into one of the kitchen chairs before her legs gave out completely. You remember, he said, and she could hear something like relief in his voice. Rachel, what's going on over there? That little girl sounded terrified, and when I tried to call back, some man answered and hung up on me. Are you in danger? Chloe was watching her mother's face with increasing curiosity, clearly trying to piece together the puzzle of this phone call. Tyler had fallen asleep in Rachel's arms, his tiny face peaceful now that his basic needs had been met. It's complicated, Rachel said finally, which was perhaps the understatement of the century. Complicated how? James's voice was patient but determined. Rachel, I've been thinking about you since that night. I tried to find you, but you left before I woke up, and I didn't have your last name or a phone number. When that little girl called tonight and gave this address, I thought. I hoped. You've been thinking about me? The words came out smaller and more vulnerable than Rachel had intended. For so long, she'd assumed that night had meant nothing to him, that she'd been just another anonymous encounter in what was probably a string of them. Every day, James said quietly, Rachel, I need to know. Are you safe? Are the children safe? Rachel looked around the kitchen, at the plate of congealed leftovers still sitting on the table, at the stack of overdue bills held down by a chipped coffee mug, at Chloe's worried face and Tyler's peaceful one. Safe felt like a foreign concept in this apartment, had felt foreign for so long that she'd almost forgotten what it meant. Define safe, she said with a bitter laugh. Don't do that, James said, his voice sharp with concern. Don't make jokes when I'm trying to help you. That little girl, Chloe, right? She sounded desperate. And if someone is forcing children to eat garbage while denying food to a baby? His voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. How do you know Chloe's name? Rachel asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Lucky guess, James said. You mentioned her that night. You were worried about getting back to her, about leaving her with the neighbor. You said she was 7 then. She'd be 8 now. The fact that he remembered such details from a night that had been filled with alcohol and emotion made Rachel's chest tighten with something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real, dangerous, terrifying hope. James, she said carefully, that night we spent together. 3 weeks later I found out I was pregnant. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Rachel wondered if he'd hung up. Then, very quietly, he said, The baby, the one that needed food tonight. How old is he? 13 months, Rachel whispered. Another silence, shorter this time. When James spoke again, his voice was steady but intense. Rachel, I'm coming over there right now. No, Rachel said quickly, panic flaring in her chest. You can't. Derek, my boyfriend, he's already suspicious about the phone call. If you show up here, then we'll figure it out, James cut her off. Rachel, if that baby is mine, if Tyler is my son, then nothing on earth is going to keep me away from him, or from you, or from Chloe. The certainty in his voice made Rachel's eyes fill with tears. For so long, she'd carried the weight of everything alone, the bills, the fear, the exhaustion, the constant worry about her children's safety and future. The idea that someone else might be willing to share that burden felt too good to be true. What if Derek comes back? She whispered. Then he'll deal with me, James said grimly. Rachel, I'm a 40-year-old man who built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing. I'm not afraid of some small-town bully who gets his kicks terrorizing women and children. The front door of the apartment slammed open at that exact moment, and Derek's voice boomed through the small space. "Rachel! Who the hell is parked in my spot downstairs?" Rachel's blood turned to ice. Through the kitchen window, she could see the headlights of an expensive-looking sedan parked in the space Derek considered his own, the space that came with their apartment, but that he guarded jealously. "He's back," she whispered into the phone. "I'm 5 minutes away," James said quickly. "Whatever happens, don't let him hurt you or the children. I'm coming, Rachel. Hold on." The line went dead just as Derek's heavy footsteps approached the kitchen. Rachel set the phone down with shaking hands, her mind racing through possible explanations for the car outside, for the phone call he'd undoubtedly overheard part of, for the way her entire world was about to change. Chloe looked at her mother with wide, frightened eyes. "Is someone coming to help us?" she whispered. Before Rachel could answer, Derek filled the kitchen doorway, his face dark with suspicion and rage. "I asked you a question, Rachel. Whose car is that? And why do I get the feeling it has something to do with your daughter's little phone call earlier?" Rachel stood up slowly, Tyler still cradled in her arms, and faced the man who had made her life hell for the past 2 years. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't afraid. Or maybe she was terrified, but for different reasons now. Because in 5 minutes, maybe less, everything was going to change. "Derek," she said quietly, "we need to talk." The silence in the kitchen stretched like a tightrope as Derek's cold eyes moved between Rachel's pale face and the cordless phone she'd just set down. Outside, the expensive sedan's headlights cut through the darkness of their run-down neighborhood like spotlights, announcing that something was different, something was about to change. "I'm waiting," Derek said, his voice deceptively calm. It was the tone he used right before his worst explosions, the quiet before the storm that had taught Rachel and Chloe to brace for impact. "Whose car is that? And what kind of lies has your brat been telling strangers about our family?" Rachel shifted Tyler to her other arm, buying herself a precious few seconds to think. The baby was still sleeping peacefully, blissfully unaware that his entire world was about to be turned upside down. Chloe remained frozen at the kitchen table, her blue eyes darting between her mother and stepfather like she was watching a tennis match played with hand grenades. "Derek, you need to calm down," Rachel said carefully, using the same voice she used to soothe frightened customers at the diner. "There's no need to get upset. I can explain everything." "Oh, you can explain everything?" Derek's laugh was harsh and bitter. "That's rich, Rachel, that's really rich. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like your daughter called some random stranger, told them a bunch of lies about how terrible her life is here, and now some knight in shining armor is showing up to rescue you all from the big bad stepfather." The apartment building's front door slammed downstairs, followed by the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Measured, determined, climbing steadily toward the 3rd floor. Derek heard it too, and his face darkened like a storm cloud gathering strength. "He's coming up here, isn't he?" Derek's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Some stranger who thinks he knows what's best for my family is actually coming up here." "This isn't your family," Chloe said suddenly, her small voice cutting through the tension like a knife through silk. Both adults turned to stare at her, surprised by her courage. "You're not my daddy, and you're not Tyler's daddy either." Derek's face went purple with rage. He took a step toward Chloe, his fist clenched at his side, and for a moment Rachel thought he might actually hit her daughter. Instead, he grabbed the back of a kitchen chair and threw it across the room, where it crashed into the wall with a sound like thunder. "You ungrateful little," Derek started, but his words were cut off by 3 firm knocks on the apartment door. The sound echoed through the small space like gunshots. Tyler stirred in Rachel's arms, but didn't wake. Chloe's eyes went wide, and Rachel felt her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. "Don't answer it," Derek hissed, moving to block the path between the kitchen and the front door. "Whoever it is, they can go to hell." But Rachel was already moving, Tyler cradled against her chest, stepping around Derek's bulk with surprising grace. She'd spent 2 years learning to navigate around his anger, learning to anticipate his movements, like a dancer avoiding a dangerous partner. "Rachel," Derek's voice carried a warning that made her spine stiffen, "don't you dare open that door." She paused with her hand on the deadbolt, looking back at the man who had controlled her life for so long through fear and manipulation. Derek stood in the kitchen doorway like a wall of muscle and rage, his work boots planted wide, his hands clenched into fists. Behind him, Chloe watched from the table with those 2 wise blue eyes. "Or what, Derek?" Rachel asked quietly. "You'll hit me? You'll scream at Chloe some more? You'll make Tyler cry by denying him food again?" She turned the deadbolt with a sharp click. "I'm done being afraid of you." The door opened to reveal a man who looked like he'd stepped out of the pages of a business magazine. James Mackenzie stood in the hallway, wearing a charcoal grey suit that probably cost more than Rachel made in 3 months. But his expensive clothes couldn't disguise the worry in his dark brown eyes or the tension in his broad shoulders. He was exactly as Rachel remembered him from that night almost a year ago, tall and lean with salt and pepper hair and the kind of strong jaw that belonged in movies. But there was something different about him now, something harder and more determined than the gentle man who had bought her drinks and listened to her troubles. "Rachel," James said softly, his eyes immediately going to Tyler sleeping in her arms. Even in sleep, the resemblance was unmistakable. Tyler had James's dark hair, his refined features, the same strong chin that was barely visible beneath baby fat, but would undoubtedly emerge as he grew. "James," Rachel breathed, and hearing his name out loud after all these months made her chest tight with emotions she'd tried to bury. "You came." "Of course I came." James stepped into the apartment, his presence immediately making the small space feel even smaller. He was clearly taking inventory, the broken chair lying against the wall, Derek's threatening posture in the kitchen doorway, Chloe's frightened face at the table. "Are you hurt? Is anyone hurt?" "We're fine," Rachel said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "No," Derek's voice boomed from behind them, making Tyler jolt in his sleep. "We are not fine. We are not fine at all." He stepped out of the kitchen, using his size and bulk to try to intimidate this stranger who had invaded his territory. "I don't know who you think you are, but you need to get the hell out of my apartment right now." James turned to face Derek, and Rachel was struck by the difference between them. Where Derek was broad and heavy with the soft bulk of too much beer and too little exercise, James was lean and athletic, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced down corporate boardrooms and hostile takeovers. Derek might have 40 pounds on him, but James had something more valuable, the kind of authority that came from genuine success and self-respect. "I'm sorry, but I don't believe we've been introduced," James said, his voice perfectly polite and completely unimpressed by Derek's bluster. "I'm James Mackenzie, and you are?" "I'm the man who pays the rent on this place," Derek snarled. "I'm the man who puts food on the table and keeps a roof over their heads. I'm the man who's been taking care of Rachel and her kids for 2 years, while their real fathers ran off like cowards." "Is that what you call it?" James asked, his tone still conversational but with steel underneath. "Taking care of them? Because from what I heard on the phone tonight, your idea of taking care of children involves forcing an 8-year-old to eat garbage while a baby cries from hunger." Derek's face went darker than Rachel had ever seen it. "You don't know what you're talking about, rich boy. You don't know anything about this family or what we've been through. You show up here in your fancy car with your expensive suit, thinking you can play hero, but you don't know the first thing about real life." "I know enough," James said quietly. His eyes found Tyler again, still sleeping peacefully in Rachel's arms, and something shifted in his expression, something protective and fierce. I know that no child should ever have to beg for food. I know that no woman should have to be afraid in her own home. And I know that no man worth calling himself a man would ever terrorize the people who depend on him for protection. Protection? Derek laughed bitterly. You want to talk about protection? Where were you when Rachel was broke and pregnant and living in a rat-infested studio apartment? Where were you when Chloe needed medical care and there was no insurance? Where were you when the bills were piling up and the electricity was about to get shut off? The questions hung in the air like accusations, and Rachel saw something flicker across James's face. Guilt, perhaps, or regret. He looked at her with those dark brown eyes, and she could see him trying to piece together the timeline, trying to understand how much pain she'd endured while he'd been living his comfortable, successful life in blissful ignorance. You're right, James said finally, surprising everyone in the room. I wasn't here. I should have been, but I wasn't. That's my fault, and it's something I'll have to live with for the rest of my life. He paused, looking directly at Tyler. But I'm here now. Yeah? Derek stepped closer, his bulk casting a shadow over James's lean frame. Well, now might be too late. This is my family now, and I don't need some stranger coming in here trying to break up what I've built. What you've built? Chloe's voice cut through the testosterone-charged air like a bell. She was standing now, having climbed down from her chair, and despite her small size, there was something fierce and determined in her posture. You haven't built anything. You just made everything worse. Chloe, Rachel warned, afraid of what Derek might do in response to such direct defiance. But Chloe wasn't finished. She looked directly at James, her blue eyes bright with unshed tears, but steady with conviction. Are you really going to help us? Are you really going to make him stop being mean to my mama and Tyler? James knelt down, so he was at Chloe's eye level, his expensive suit forgotten as he gave her his complete attention. Yes, he said simply, I promise you, Chloe, things are going to be different now. You can't promise that, Derek snarled. You don't have any right to promise anything to anyone in this family. You're nobody. You're nothing. James stood up slowly, and when he looked at Derek this time, there was something different in his expression, something cold and final. Actually, Derek, I think I might be more than nothing. In fact, I think I might be exactly what this family has been waiting for. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his cell phone, speed dialing a number with practiced ease. Marcus, it's James. I need you to do 2 things for me right now. First, I need you to run a background check on a Derek. He looked questioningly at Rachel. Patterson, Rachel whispered. Derek Patterson, currently residing at 847 Cedar Street, apartment 3B. I need to know about any criminal history, outstanding warrants, anything that might be relevant. Second, I need you to arrange for a private DNA test first thing in the morning. Rush job, money no object. His eyes found Tyler again, sleeping peacefully in Rachel's arms. I'll send you the details. Derek's face went white, then red, then white again. What the hell do you think you're doing? James ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. I'm doing what I should have done a year ago, Derek. I'm taking responsibility. The apartment fell silent except for the sound of Tyler's soft breathing and the distant hum of traffic outside. Rachel felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into a future that could be wonderful or terrible, depending on which way the wind blew. Derek, she said quietly, I think you should leave. Derek's head snapped toward her like she'd slapped him. What did you say? I said you should leave. Rachel's voice was stronger now, steadier. Pack your things and go, tonight. This is my apartment too, Derek said, but his bluster was weaker now, less convincing. My name is on the lease. You can't kick me out. Actually, James said conversationally. "I think you'll find that's not quite accurate. My assistant is very thorough, Derek. The lease on this apartment is in Rachel's name only. Your name appears nowhere on any legal documents related to this residence." Derek stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "How do you? You can't know that. You just got here." "I make it my business to know things," James said simply. "It's how I built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing. Information is power, Derek, and right now I have all the information and you have none." The truth of it settled over the room like dust after an explosion. Derek looked around the apartment, at the broken chair, at the plate of congealed leftovers still sitting on the table, at the woman and children he'd terrorized for 2 years, and seemed to realize for the first time that his reign of power was ending. "This isn't over," he said finally, his voice ugly with impotent rage. "Yes," James said quietly, "it is." The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window of James Mackenzie's penthouse apartment, casting golden rectangles across the marble countertops and gleaming appliances that looked like they belonged in a magazine rather than a real home. Rachel stood at the island, bouncing Tyler gently in her arms while she watched James flip pancakes on the professional-grade stovetop with the kind of casual competence that spoke of practice. It had been 3 days since Derek had finally stormed out of the apartment on Cedar Street, taking his anger and his threats with him, but leaving behind a silence that felt more precious than gold. 3 days since James had insisted on moving them all to his penthouse for safety reasons, though Rachel suspected his motives were more complex than simple concern for their security. "These are really good," Chloe announced from her perch on one of the leather bar stools, her legs swinging freely as she worked her way through a stack of blueberry pancakes that was taller than her fist. "Better than the ones at the diner." "Don't let Margie hear you say that," Rachel said with a smile, referring to the head cook at the restaurant where she'd been working double shifts for the past 2 years. "She's very proud of her pancake recipe." "Speaking of Margie," James said, sliding another pancake onto Chloe's plate, "have you given any more thought to what we discussed yesterday?" Rachel's stomach tightened. What they discussed yesterday was whether she was ready to quit her job at the diner. Both jobs, actually, since she'd been pulling shifts at 2 different restaurants to make ends meet. James had made the suggestion casually, almost offhandedly, but she could hear the intent behind his words. "I don't know," she said carefully. "Those jobs. They're all I've known for the past few years. They're how I've survived. But they're not how you're going to thrive," James said gently, turning away from the stove to look at her directly. In the morning light, wearing jeans and a casual button-down shirt instead of his business suits, he looked younger, more approachable. But those dark brown eyes still held the same intensity that had first caught her attention in that bar almost a year ago. Tyler made a small sound and reached for James with his tiny hands, a gesture that had become increasingly common over the past 3 days. James's face softened as he took the baby, settling him against his chest with the natural ease of someone who'd been born to be a father. The resemblance between them was even more pronounced in the morning light. Tyler had James's dark hair, his strong chin, and most tellingly his eyes, the same warm brown that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. The DNA test results wouldn't be back for another few days, but Rachel didn't need a laboratory to tell her what her heart already knew. "Mama," Chloe said around a mouthful of pancake, "can we stay here forever?" The question hung in the air like a soap bubble, beautiful and fragile and potentially devastating if handled wrong. Rachel looked around the penthouse, at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, at the modern art on the walls, at the kind of luxury she'd only seen in movies. It was everything she'd never dared to dream of, but it also felt like a fairy tale, and fairy tales had a way of ending when you least expected it. "Sweetheart, this isn't our home," Rachel said gently. "This is James's home. We're just visiting until we figure out what comes next. What if what comes next is this? James asked quietly, his voice careful but determined. What if this could be your home? Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Tyler gurgled happily in James's arms, completely oblivious to the weight of the conversation happening around him. Chloe stopped chewing and looked between the adults with those perceptive blue eyes that missed nothing. James, Rachel started, but he held up a hand to stop her. I know what you're going to say, he said. It's too fast, too soon. We barely know each other. You don't want charity, and you don't want to be anyone's obligation. He paused, adjusting Tyler in his arms. But what if it's not charity? What if it's not obligation? What if it's just right? Before Rachel could respond, the doorbell chimed with the kind of melodious sound that probably cost more than her monthly rent. James frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone this early in the morning. I'll get it, he said, handing Tyler back to Rachel. You two finish your breakfast. He disappeared toward the front of the penthouse, and Rachel could hear the murmur of voices in the entryway, too low to make out words, but carrying an urgency that made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. Tyler fussed in her arms, sensing her tension, and she began the automatic bouncing motion that had become second nature. Mama? Chloe's voice was small and worried. Is Derek coming back? No, baby, Rachel said firmly, though her own heart was racing. Derek is not coming back. James promised, remember? James reappeared in the kitchen doorway, his face grim. Behind him followed a tall, thin man in a cheap suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Rachel, James said carefully, this is Detective Morrison from the downtown precinct. He needs to speak with you about Derek. Rachel's knees went weak. She sank down onto one of the bar stools, clutching Tyler against her chest. What about Derek? What's happened? Detective Morrison stepped forward, his expression professionally sympathetic. Ma'am, Derek Patterson was arrested last night on charges of domestic violence and child endangerment. We have a warrant out for him based on evidence collected from your previous apartment, including testimony from neighbors and... He glanced at Chloe, who was listening with wide eyes. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. Whatever you have to say, you can say in front of my family, Rachel said, the word family slipping out before she could stop it. She felt James's eyes on her, but couldn't bring herself to look at him. Detective Morrison nodded slowly. The charges are serious, ma'am. Multiple counts of domestic violence, child endangerment, destruction of property. We also found evidence of unpaid child support from a previous relationship, which violates his parole from a conviction 5 years ago for assault and battery. Rachel's head spun. Parole? I didn't know he'd been in prison. Yes, ma'am. Served 18 months for attacking his ex-girlfriend's brother with a tire iron. He was supposed to be checking in with a parole officer monthly, but he'd been skipping appointments for over a year. Detective Morrison consulted his notes. If convicted on these new charges, he's looking at significant prison time. 5 to 10 years, minimum. The kitchen fell silent except for Tyler's soft babbling. Rachel felt like she was in a dream, or maybe waking up from one. For 2 years, she'd lived in fear of Derek's anger, his unpredictability, his threats. The idea that he might be gone permanently, that she might never have to see his face or hear his voice again, was almost too wonderful to believe. There is one thing, Detective Morrison continued. He's been making some wild claims about being set up, about some rich guy hiring private investigators to dig up dirt on him. He specifically mentioned you, Mr. Mackenzie. James's expression didn't change, but Rachel caught something flickering in his eyes. Is that so? Yes, sir. Now I want to be clear. Everything we found on Patterson is legitimate. The man has a rap sheet longer than my arm, and the evidence of domestic violence is overwhelming. But he seems to think you orchestrated his arrest somehow. Detective Morrison, James said calmly, I'm a businessman. When someone threatens my family, I protect them using every legal means at my disposal. If that means hiring investigators to ensure dangerous individuals are held accountable for their crimes, then yes, I'm guilty as charged. My family. Rachel's heart did a small flip at the words. Tyler chose that moment to reach for James again, making happy gurgling sounds that echoed through the expensive kitchen. Detective Morrison watched the interaction with interest. The child seems attached to you, sir. We're waiting for DNA test results, James said quietly, taking Tyler from Rachel's arms. But regardless of what those tests show, Tyler is family now. They all are. Chloe beamed from her bar stool, sticky with syrup, but radiating happiness. Are you going to be my new daddy? She asked James, with the directness that only children possessed. James knelt down so he was at her eye level, Tyler still cradled in his arms. Chloe, I would be honored to be your daddy, if that's what you want and what your mama wants. Rachel felt tears prick at her eyes. This man, this wonderful, successful, complicated man, was offering them everything she'd ever dreamed of. Not just financial security, but genuine love and protection, and a future that stretched out bright and full of possibilities. What about the official paperwork? She asked Detective Morrison, trying to focus on practical matters before her emotions completely overwhelmed her. You'll need to testify at his trial, most likely. But given the evidence we have, I'd be surprised if Patterson doesn't take a plea deal. His lawyer is already making noises about it. The detective closed his notebook. In the meantime, if he makes any attempt to contact you, or comes anywhere near you or the children, you call us immediately. He won't, James said with quiet certainty. I've made it very clear to Mr. Patterson that any further contact with this family would be inadvisable. Detective Morrison looked like he wanted to ask more questions about that statement, but thought better of it. Instead, he handed Rachel his business card and headed for the door. After he left, the kitchen fell into a comfortable quiet. Tyler had fallen asleep in James's arms, his tiny hand fisted in the soft cotton of James's shirt. Chloe had finished her pancakes and was now drawing on a notepad James had given her, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. So, James said softly, settling into the chair next to Rachel's, what do you think about staying, I mean? About making this work. Rachel looked around the kitchen again, at the expensive appliances and the view of the city and the man holding her son like he was the most precious thing in the world. It should have felt overwhelming. Too good to be true, like accepting charity from a stranger. Instead, it felt like coming home. I think, she said carefully, that maybe Chloe was right. Maybe we could stay here forever. James's smile was brighter than the morning sun streaming through the windows. Forever sounds perfect to me. 6 months later, Rachel Mackenzie stood in the doorway of what had once been James's home office, watching her husband help 9-year-old Chloe with her math homework while 18-month-old Tyler played with blocks on the carpet nearby. The room had been completely transformed. The imposing desk and intimidating bookshelves had been replaced with kid-sized furniture, colorful rugs, and walls covered with Chloe's artwork and Tyler's handprint paintings. But why do we have to carry the one? Chloe was asking, her pencil hovering over an addition problem that would have stumped most children her age. Can't we just add the numbers straight across? Because, James said patiently, when 2 numbers add up to more than 9, we have to put the extra amount in the next column. It's like, remember when we were organizing your toys? When you had more than 10 dolls, what did we do? We made another box, Chloe said, her face lighting up with understanding. So the extra one goes in the next box. Exactly, James grinned, ruffling her hair. You're getting so good at this, sweetheart. Rachel leaned against the doorframe, her heart full to bursting as she watched the scene. It still amazed her sometimes how naturally James had taken to fatherhood, how completely he'd embraced not just Tyler, but Chloe as well. The adoption papers had been finalized just last week, making it official. Chloe Mackenzie was legally and completely his daughter now, with all the love and protection that came with the name. Tyler looked up from his blocks and spotted Rachel in the doorway. "Mama!" he called out, his vocabulary expanding daily now that he lived in a house full of people who had time to talk to him, to read to him, to answer his endless questions about the world. "Hi, baby boy," Rachel said, coming into the room to scoop him up. At 18 months, Tyler was walking confidently and climbing everything he could reach, his personality emerging as sweet and determined and just a little bit mischievous. The DNA test had confirmed what everyone already knew. He was James's son in every way that mattered, from his dark brown eyes to his stubborn streak when it came to bedtime. "How was your day?" James asked, wrapping his arms around both her and Tyler in the kind of casual family hug that still made Rachel's heart skip beats. She'd never imagined that love could feel this easy, this natural, this right. "Good," she said, settling into his embrace. "Dr. Peterson says Tyler's speech development is right on track, maybe even a little advanced. And I had lunch with my mom." That was still a work in progress. Rachel's relationship with her mother, who lived 3 states away and had spent the past 2 years disapproving of Rachel's choices from a distance. The news that her daughter had married a millionaire CEO had certainly changed her tune, but Rachel was taking that reconciliation slowly, carefully. "What did Grandma Linda have to say this time?" Chloe asked, looking up from her math homework with interest. "She wants to come visit for Tyler's 2nd birthday next month," Rachel said. "And she's very excited about meeting all of you properly." "Will she bring presents?" Chloe asked, with the mercenary interest of a child who had recently discovered that having wealthy relatives came with certain perks. "Probably," Rachel laughed. "But remember what we talked about. Presents are nice, but they're not the most important thing about family." "I know, Mama," Chloe said solemnly. "The most important thing is love and feeling safe and having someone who will always take care of you no matter what." James caught Rachel's eye over Chloe's head, and she saw her own emotion reflected in his expression. This little girl had been through so much, had seen things no child should ever see, but she was resilient and wise and full of hope for the future. The doorbell chimed, and James frowned. "Are we expecting anyone?" "Actually, yes," Rachel said, trying to keep the excitement out of her voice. "I may have arranged a little surprise." She disappeared toward the front door, leaving James looking confused and curious. Tyler toddled after her on his sturdy little legs, chattering to himself in the mixture of real words and baby babble that passed for his conversation these days. Rachel returned a few minutes later, leading a delegation that made James's eyes widen. Detective Morrison, a woman in a business suit carrying a briefcase, and someone James definitely hadn't expected to see. His older brother Michael, who lived in Chicago and rarely visited without extensive advance planning. "What's all this?" James asked, standing up from the tiny table where he'd been helping Chloe. "James Mackenzie," the woman in the business suit said, stepping forward. "I'm Sarah Wellington from the district attorney's office. I'm here to inform you that Derek Patterson has accepted a plea deal and will be serving 8 to 12 years in state prison. He's also signed an agreement never to contact your family again, and he's waiving all parental rights to any children in your household." James felt a weight he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying lift off his shoulders. "He signed the papers?" "This morning," Detective Morrison confirmed. "He also wanted me to give you this." He handed James an envelope with his name written on it in Derek's crude handwriting. James opened it and read the short message inside. "You win. Take care of them." Nothing more, nothing less. But it felt like the closing of a chapter that had hung over their family like a dark cloud. "There's more," Rachel said, her eyes sparkling with barely contained excitement. "Michael?" James's brother stepped forward, a wide grin on his face. "Surprise, little brother. Rachel called me last week and told me about some of the amazing work you've been doing with children's advocacy groups since all this started." It was true. Meeting Chloe and seeing firsthand what child abuse looked like had lit a fire in James that he hadn't expected. He'd started quietly funding programs for at-risk children, working with lawyers to help families escape dangerous situations, using his wealth and influence to make a real difference in the world. "The Chicago Children's Foundation wants to offer you a position," Michael continued, "Director of Family Advocacy Services. It would mean moving to Chicago, but the foundation is prepared to offer you a salary and benefits package that would make even a millionaire CEO happy." James looked around the room, at Rachel's excited face, at Chloe's wide eyes, at Tyler babbling happily at his feet. "Chicago? It's a big decision," Rachel said quickly, "and we don't have to decide right now. But James, you should see the work they're doing there, the families they're helping. It's everything you've been passionate about, but on a scale that could change thousands of lives." "What do you think, Chloe?" James asked, turning to his daughter. "How would you feel about moving to Chicago?" Chloe considered this with the seriousness of a Supreme Court justice. "Would we all go together?" "Of course," James said. "We're a family now. We stick together." "Then I think it sounds like an adventure," Chloe said decisively. "And adventures are good for families, right?" "Right," James agreed, scooping her up in a hug that made her giggle. "Adventures are very good for families." 2 hours later, after all the visitors had left and the children were asleep in their beds, James and Rachel sat on their bedroom balcony overlooking the city lights. Rachel was curled up in James's arms, her head on his shoulder, feeling more content than she'd ever imagined possible. "Are you sure about Chicago?" she asked softly. "It's a big change. The biggest changes in my life have been the best ones," James said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Meeting you, finding Tyler, getting to be Chloe's dad. None of that was planned, but all of it was perfect. Even Derek and all the drama he caused." "Even Derek," James said firmly. "If you hadn't been with him, if Chloe hadn't made that phone call, if everything hadn't happened exactly the way it did, we might never have found each other again. Sometimes the worst things lead to the best things." Rachel lifted her head to look at him, this man who had changed her entire world with his kindness and strength and unwavering commitment to their little family. "I love you, James Mackenzie." "I love you too, Rachel Mackenzie," he said, and kissed her as the city sparkled below them like a promise of all the bright tomorrows that lay ahead. Inside the penthouse, Tyler stirred in his crib and settled back into sleep with a contented sigh. Down the hall, Chloe dreamed of adventures and new cities and a daddy who would never let anyone hurt her family again. And somewhere in a state prison, Derek Patterson lay on his narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling, finally understanding that the best thing he'd ever done for Rachel and the children was letting them go. The Mackenzie family was complete. Their future was bright, and their love was strong enough to weather any storm that might come their way. It had started with a desperate phone call from a frightened little girl, but it had become something beautiful, a testament to the power of hope, the strength of love, and the magic that happens when broken people find each other and choose to heal together. Sometimes the most unexpected phone calls change everything. Sometimes the people who hurt us lead us to the people who heal us. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, our darkest moments become the foundation for our brightest future. The Mackenzie family knew that now, and they would carry that knowledge with them wherever their adventures might lead.